So a few years ago, I decided to rewatch all of NinjaGo up until that point, since March the Oni was right around the corner. After I was through, I decided on a whim to make a video ranking all 10 seasons and released it. It did okay at first and got a couple thousand or so views in a month, and I was pleasantly surprised. Then the YouTube algorithm hit just right. Now it's one of my consistently top performing videos and my second most watched video of all time. Well, okay. Since then, I've made other NinjaGo content on a more regular basis, and while it's all done pretty well, I've been consistently asked to re-rank all the seasons when a new one comes out. My argument before is that I was waiting for 20 seasons like I originally said at the end of that first video, but with Crystallized marking another thematic ending that the series likes to do every so often, and the future of the series once more in question with both Tommy Andreasen and Braggy Shoot leaving their positions as head creatives, I think it's time to give in and rank everything up until this point. And by everything, I pretty much mean everything. This time around, I will be including the pilots and Day That Departed on this list, along with The Island. However, I won't be going as in-depth on some of these placements, as at large, my thoughts on a lot of the old seasons haven't changed much, and I've probably talked about them at length in a bunch of other videos you can go watch so I don't have to repeat myself. With that said, let's go ahead and get started, as even with breezing through some of the older seasons, there's still plenty to talk about here. So we'll begin with number 18, Rebooted. To longtime viewers of mine, you're probably not surprised by this, as I've talked about my hatred for the season in my original rankings video, and then made an 8-episode miniseries that rewrote the entire thing. The main reason I'd left it where it is at the bottom of the list, besides the previous gripes I have, is because unlike a few seasons that rank higher, I don't think this season has a single good episode to spare. Rebooted is 8 episodes of head-scratching, anger-inducing, mind-numbing dumbness through and through. While it introduces characters like Cyrus Borg and Pixel, who would become fan favorites later on, their introductory season is riddled with so many plot holes you could put it in a package of Swiss cheese. So we'll go ahead and move on before I end up ranting again, because lots of the problems I have with this season, I also have with the next one. Number 17, Crystallized. The latest season of the show as of this writing, and yet another ending to the story. I'll be discussing spoilers for this season to discuss why it ranks so low, so if you somehow haven't been spoiled yet, skip to this timestamp. Everyone here that's going to stick around? Okay, good. I could probably make an entire video series detailing why this season is so bad, but I honestly don't have the energy, and TTV have covered the topic pretty extensively at this point. I pretty much agree with everything they had to say. So go ahead and watch those podcasts if you want to listen to like 6 hours of crystallized discussion. They were really good at digging into the minutiae of why the season fails on almost every level. I myself have even made 3 videos on the subject already, one before the season was released, one midway through, and one after it was over. With a little distance between the release and now, I think my 2 biggest issues are just the cementing that the Overlord is a lame villain that should have come back after Season 2, and that the season doesn't actually do anything new. In some way, that could have actually worked, especially since Crystallize is acting as an ending to the story up until this point. The Overlord having a powerful but disposable army lacking in personality outside of the generals isn't new to him as a character or the series. If anything, it's a staple, and Vengestone warriors could have been an ultimate threat for the ninja to face since they negate their elemental powers. Like a lot of NinjaGo goons, the ninja are able to find a way to beat them after initial battle where they seem too OP, and they become pushovers that are all taken out Phantom Menace style by the end. None of this is new, and yet the show and characters treat it as it is. And you can say that for a lot of story beats and character moments this season. While there is an occasional callback to an older season like the inclusion of Pythor and Nia returning to the role of Samurai X, everything else just feels really rehashed outside of the first few episodes where the ninja focus on saving Nia's humanity. The ninja have been in prison before, the Overlord has attacked NinjaGo City twice before, Nia doubted herself and ultimately found her inner strength before. Like, twice. And the ninja have sacrificed their elemental powers to save Lloyd before. I could really go on and on with what this season repeats all the way down to the writers giving Zane a quirk of the season because they don't know what to do with him. In Possession, he's swapped through various voices because of a glitch, in Hands of Time, he's missing Pixel, and in Crystallized, he turns off his emotions. While Crystallized is supposed to be an ending to the story so far, and in some ways it is, it really feels more like an ending to the Braggy Shoot era of the show than anything because of all those repeated plot threads. Crystallized takes all the NinjaGo bad tropes, mixes them together, and spits them all out onto a forced happy ending that tries to mimic the emotional payoffs that Avengers Endgame gave us. In a lot of ways, this is the ultimate worst season of NinjaGo and actually deserves to be in the last place below Rebooted. But on a first watch, the season is actually engaging and you want to know what happens next even if you know what's coming from a mile away. I didn't get that from Rebooted, as that season feels so removed from the prior 2 seasons story-wise and aesthetically that it feels off from where to go. Crystallized at least lulled me into a false sense of security and engagement left over from Seabound that it took time for the facade to fade away and realization to kick in to what was happening. That alone saves the season from being at the bottom, but not even some of the cool fights could save it from being very close to the bottom. So we'll just go ahead and move on so this video isn't like an hour and a half long. Number 16, Day of the Departed. Next up is NinjaGo's poor attempt at a spooky Halloween episode. I've talked about this before in my worst episodes video, and there's not much else to say. Its brevity doesn't help its very rushed and cobbled together storyline, and it doesn't really do Cole's story at the time much service, as him being a ghost was really cool and engaging. It's not worth much more than a single watch, and so it sits really low on this list too. Number 15, Hands of Time. NinjaGo at this point is clearly a hard franchise to write for. It's not something any writer can tackle, and that's evident throughout half of the series at this point, really. Even the Hagmans, who were the original writers for the theme, didn't have a flawless track record, as they're the writers for Rebooted. Thankfully for them, they didn't have to take credits for Hands of Time, which had an entirely different set of writers for the first time in the theme's lifetime. When a writer isn't firing on all cylinders, or is being rushed, or just isn't quite in tune with the theme, we get products like this and the movie, which is ironic considering both came out in the same year. I've talked about the poor quality of this season in multiple videos, but I think the worst part is that at the end of the day, it's really just kind of boring in its badness. It's not horrendously bad for the most part, as there are a few good moments early on and at the end, but generally this season just falls flat thanks to the bad writing and poor animation at Willfilm, which they themselves said they weren't satisfied with and devoted the next several years to solely working on LEGO projects. With a decent idea at its core of unraveling the mystery that was Kai and Nia's parents, it's not enough to save this very mediocre season, and it's one I'd be happy to wind back time and forget. Number 14, Prime Empire. The second season produced under WildBrain Animation without any input from the Hagmans, Prime Empire is many things, but at least it's not boring. The biggest issue this season has is pacing, as it had so few episodes in its runtime compared to the previous year that they had to designate online shorts to explain some of the story and showcase certain scenes that should have been in the season itself. It's something that hasn't happened since, so clearly something funky went on behind the scenes of this season, and it shows. By the end, the season turns into a cheap repeat of Skybound, with each ninja being systematically eliminated one by one, only until Jay and Nia are left. As a twist on Skybound though, the season doesn't really have a main villain outside of the mechanic, as Unagami is more misunderstood than anything. With the proper time dedicated to it, this could have been a really cool ending given the parallel that both Jay and Unagami never really knew their original creators. Unfortunately, this falls flat, and while new characters like Okino are cool, time could have been spent elsewhere to help further develop the story. But while it's overall weak season when it comes to the story, Prime Empire is a top 3 season when it comes to visual presentation. WildBrain nails the cool futuristic Tron-inspired video game world they're going for, and the score to this season is arguably one of the best that Jay Vincent and Michael Kramer have made for the show, with how much variety it has. It perfectly balances the classic orchestral style NinjaGo is known for, with electronic synth that feels more at home than a similar style did in Rebooted. Plus, while the story is oddly paced, it was clear the writers and production teams were big fans of video games, and that passion can be felt through all the small references tucked away here and there. While it's a season that has a few glitches, it's something that at least you can tell the people making it had fun working on, and this time around, that's a good thing. Number 13, The Island. In short, The Island is perfectly fine. I don't love it, I don't hate it. It's a perfectly acceptable 44-minute special that does a decent job teeing us up for Seabound, and it brought back Ronan, so that's cool. That's really all I have to say about it, as it leaves so little impact that it can't be better than anything above it on the list, but it's not offensive like some of the things below it. So, there we are. Number 12, The Final Battle. NinjaGo's first issue of pacing cropped up in its second and what was supposed to be its last season. Out of 13 episodes, only the last 7 really tell a full story, and the previous filler episodes aren't worth much outside of Child's Play. I talked more about it in the original season rankings video, and my points from there still stand for the most part. The season gains points for introducing Dareth, but then loses them for introducing the Overlord, so middle of the list it is. And it's just funny to laugh at now, honestly. Final Battle, what a joke. Number 11, The Pilots. Much like The Island, I don't have much to say on these episodes since the runtime is pretty short, but they were good enough to lay the foundation for everything that came afterwards, so that counts for a lot. While there's a few oddities here and there to be found, like Jay's Brooklyn accent that gradually disappears, the pilots are a generally solid introduction to the world and characters, and is also what helped cement my continued love for LEGO at a time in my adolescence when I could have easily left it behind. But here I am at 24, still talking about plastic characters to random people on the internet. So thank you NinjaGo Pilot episodes, I salute you for that. Number 10, Secrets of the Forbidden Spinjitzu. A surprise to many of you for sure, but I don't think that Season 11 is really that bad. It has some hiccups for sure, being the first season produced by WildBrain with the shorter 11-minute episode runtimes, but all in all, it's decent. Except for maybe 1 or 2 episodes, this season doesn't actually have any filler to it like many people claim, and it was cool to see what some of the shorter episode format could do for the story. Seeing the attacks on the city from the point of view of the citizens in a couple episodes helps continue the story while also giving us a fresh spin on these all too often giant invasions we've seen several times before and since. For the most part, I feel like the fire chapter works out pretty well, even if it's a little simplistic sometimes. The ice chapter is where things get more complicated, and why I debated putting this before or after the pilots. I ended up going with after the pilots, thus making it higher on the list, because we do get a little bit more out of the characters since this is a much longer story. While the pilots were mainly Kai's show, everyone gets a little something to do in Season 11, even if that doesn't always turn out so well for them. Nia and Zane especially have story arcs that almost harm their characters as a whole, with Nia being a little repetitive and Zane's time as a dictator of another realm never mentioned again except as a throwaway joke. Still, the new animation style was, while jarring at first, I'd say an upgrade from Wilfilm, as fights in the newer seasons have been consistently awesome, even if the stories have not been. However, while this season sometimes takes advantage of the 11-minute format, the new episode length and the pacing was something the writing team was never able to really master, and unfortunately to me seems like a failed experiment. It's partly for that reason and a few other stumbles that we find Season 11 at the halfway point on this list, which is still probably higher than many think it deserves. Number 9, March of the Oni. It's interesting what a little bit of time perspective will do for something. In my original rankings video, March of the Oni was in the lower half of the list thanks to the rushed nature of its story and its underwhelming villains in Omega and the Oni. However, while it still has its flaws, this 4-episode miniseason has actually aged rather well. While it is a still rather rushed story, it feels much more like a natural conclusion to the story arc at the time than Crystallized does years later. No one really had much of a problem with the actual storyline of March of the Oni, and more that it just didn't have enough time to let the story breathe properly. Unlike Crystallized, March of the Oni actually has some pretty good callbacks to seasons past and uses them to enhance the story rather than just point-at-the-screen cameos. While too short, with the way the story ends, NinjaGo could have stopped here, and I don't think anyone would have been upset about an unsatisfying ending, as most everything was paid off and the story came full circle from the pilots. It's not the best NinjaGo has to offer, but it did its job well enough, and the writing staff for Crystallized should have taken better notes on how to do an ending. Number 8, Rise of the Snakes. The season that really started it all after the pilots, Rise of the Snakes is still a really good first full outing for our characters and the world of NinjaGo. Lots of dynamics are set up here, from Lloyd and his father's troubled relationship to the brotherhood the ninja would form with one another. It's all done really well, and the show manages to balance episodic adventures and an overarching narrative better than some seasons that would come afterward. Above all else though, these early episodes have a good sense of charm to them as the team found their footing. While it sometimes feels like an obvious toy commercial, that's quickly masked by the fun tone and still pretty well animated action for the time. While I enjoy NinjaGo when it goes darker, it's fun to peek back all those years ago now and look back on simpler times at what helped make NinjaGo a success to begin with. So while a little bit of nostalgia may be talking here, this season is really what helped make the show and theme popular in the first place, and we wouldn't have any of these following seasons if not for this one. So that has to count for something when looking back. While it shows its age somewhat, you can't go wrong with watching this season. Number 7, Master of the Mountain. It may be a surprise to see the season as low as it is, but at this point in the list, we've got some really stiff competition. Like Tournament of Elements and Sons of Garmadon before it, Master of the Mountain was a relief after a few rocky seasons. The reason I have it so low is because it's just a little too simple for my tastes. That doesn't make it bad at all, and I don't have any major complaints as a whole, but compared to the seasons that are higher up on this list, and the story is overall more of a straightforward adventure. However, I could totally see that making it higher on other people's lists as it doesn't get bogged down with overcomplicated lore or questionable character choices. It's a rousing adventure from start to finish, and an unfortunately fantastic swan song for Kirby Morrow in the role of Cole, as while he was in Seabound before he passed away, the spotlight is firmly on him here and he shines bright. There's not a bad episode in the bunch here, and a lot of that early Season 1 charm that can get lost from time to time is very evident in the new side characters. The Upley and Princess Vanya feel right at home amongst the pantheon of other great NinjaGo side characters, and don't feel like they intrude as some others tend to do sometimes. The season also had a fun surprise in the Munts and Geckles, and instead of being antagonists like the toy box art suggested, they actually played a fun role as quirky allies to the ninja. While a really good season, the Spinjitzu burst wasn't quite enough to get it higher on this list though. Number 6, Hunted. The second of 3 parts in the Oni trilogy, Hunted does a great job of continuously raising the stakes and keeping the tension high. Between the resistance operating in NinjaGo City to the exploration of the first realm, this season kept the drama ramped up and paid it off in spectacular fashion by the end. Emperor Garmadon and Harumi make for a fantastic villainous duo, which I've raved about before, and everyone gets a little something to do, including Dareth. A clear inspiration for a major chunk of Crystallized, that season wishes it could do this type of story as well as Hunted does. However, for as good as it is, it doesn't quite break the top 5. Number 5, Possession. A much better ghost story than Day of the Departed, the only real flaw I can find with this season is that the story feels like it drags a little in the middle, and Zane's constantly changing voice was a really weird gimmick. Otherwise, I love this season. Ronan was a great, morally great character to introduce, and Nia's transition into the Water Ninja and away from Samurai X was a great move for her character. Also ironic that this season has a big emphasis on water and was airing at the same time our basement flooded. Funny coincidence I'll always remember. I've talked about how good the story beats and overall atmosphere are in previous videos though, so I won't say much more on the matter here, but Possession is a spooky good time at any point of the year. Number 4, Tournament of Elements. A big step up from Rebooted, it was fun to see the ninjas sort of be set against one another for a moment in a more natural way as opposed to a forced love triangle that still lingered from the previous season. Sensei Garmadon and Master Chin are the breakout stars of this season. Chin so clearly loves being evil it's impossible not to find his energy hilariously infectious. And then Garmadon Lloyd's story comes to a close so well at the end that bringing him back later was a huge risk. While Sensei Garmadon and Hunted did the character justice, I'm not sure their dynamic has ever again reached the heights it did here. On top of that, this season introduced us to the Elemental Masters, and they were used so well that their exclusion in several seasons after this has always been confusing. Like last time though, it couldn't quite make it to the top despite how good it is, but that's really just a testament to how good the next seasons are. Honorable mention, the Dark Island Trilogy. Before we get into the top 3, I do want to go ahead and shout out the Dark Island Trilogy since it is a canon story, but aside from my stop motion adaptation, I can't include it on this list since it's a series of graphic novels and not even a TV special like Day of the Departed. If I had to rank it, I'd probably place it between March of the Oni and Rise of the Snakes, as the story serves as a good epilogue to Skybound, but doesn't have the benefit of being a full season. Still, for being something that was just supposed to fill time during the year-long delay of the movie, this story more than justifies its existence and would have been a worthy contender for this list if it had been animated by anyone other than me. But I'm too biased to include it at this point, so to the murky realm of honorable mentions, it shall remain. Number 3, Seabound. I said in my review when the season came out that this was instantly a top 3 season, and I stand by that assessment. However, it ends up in the number 3 spot mostly because of circumstances outside of its own control. Nearly everything about this season is perfect, and I really don't have too much to say about it because if I were to go in depth, I'd just gush about it the whole time. So I'll try to touch on some highlights. Obviously, the conclusion of Nia's understated and long-running character arc was really cool and handled well. Our girl deserved the spotlight and she used every moment of it to her advantage. Like most of the WildBrain seasons, the animation is stunning, and the way they animate a lot of the water here is especially really cool and different in some ways than you'd expect them to animate it. The animation of the WildBrain era might even be worth its own video someday. And like with Master of the Mountain, the characterization of the new characters is done superbly and they feel like perfect additions to the world, especially Kalmar, who is an excellent villain. And of course, we can't talk about this season without mentioning the end, which despite being foreshadowed heavily throughout, was still heartbreaking to witness. Essentially killing off or removing a core cast member who had been there since the beginning was a difficult task for the writing team, and they more than pulled it off. And instead of leaving us on an obvious cliffhanger like Hands of Time that teases an eventual return, Seabound ends on a bittersweet note of finality that Nia's story is done and she went off saving her friends and family along with all NinjaGo. While the ending and its impact are amazing, this is a big reason why the season is only in 3rd place when I would have loved to consider it for 1st or 2nd. The ending is awesome, but thanks to Crystallized, it has no meaning whatsoever. All that wonderful build-up and payoff, elevating Nia and giving her a really good story that worked perfectly with all sorts of pros and cons to her characterization, is all undone when the ninja managed to bring her back early in the next season. That alone isn't really the biggest issue, as they could have brought her back in a way that she'd retained her humanity, but was forever altered and had to live in her new form and the struggles that came with that. But instead, they simply retread the same ground that Nia had gone over a couple times earlier, and by the end of the season, it's clear her powers are going to return in full force, both diminishing her own sacrifice and Naiad's during the time of the first Spinjitzu Master. While Seabound is awesome overall, and it's still a really good watch, it's forever tainted somewhat thanks to what came immediately after, and that unfortunately holds it back to the 3rd best season overall. Number 2, Sons of Garmadon. Probably not really worth explaining at this point. I love it, you love it, it's a great season. Sam Vincent is great as Lloyd, Harumi makes for an awesome surprise villain, and Garmadon's return is harrowing and heartbreaking in the best way instead of forced and boring. The only real knock I still have against this season is the cliffhanger ending, but it's not the worst thing in the world, and just makes going into Hunted even more fun. So kudos for reaching number 2, Sons of Garmadon, but once again, you couldn't quite beat the best season. Number 1, Skybound. Like last time, I'm sure this will ruffle feathers, but I love this season from stem to stern, and it's NinjaGo at its best and arguably darkest. Notakon the Jin is such a formidable opponent that while I want him to come back, him actually doing so could potentially spell more disaster for NinjaGo than yet another Overlord resurrection. While the potential for him to be a great returning villain is off the charts, I'm not sure I have much faith in the writing team at this point, so maybe he should stay in that teapot for a bit longer. But regardless of how he could be treated in the future, he was handled perfectly in his only season so far, and rewatching it is always a blast. To me, 2015 to early 2016 will always be peak NinjaGo, as the 3 excellent seasons in a row were a treat, especially nowadays when it seems like we're in a coin toss as to whether or not the next one will be any good. So, that's my new seasons ranking as of 2022. While I'm not exactly sure where the story is heading next given how Crystallized ended and the new writing team, as well as at least one new wave of core in 2023, I'm still hopeful that more good Ninjago story content is on the way, even if it takes a while. This theme has so much potential, and I think the top 10 or so entries on this list are proof of that. So what do you think of this list? Love it? Hate it? Think Hands of Time is underrated? Let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you guys for more Ninjago content in 2023.